There's no single recipe for AI transformation, and when setting the right approach, you must of course consider your existing maturity level and the constraints that you have in your business at this moment. Now, when we meet clients, most clients fall into 3 common scenarios that are helpful in understanding when determining the right approach. Now, in the first scenario, we meet organizations that typically have high AI ambition, but the value of AI remains unproven, and there's no clear mandate in place to actually drive the AI transformation. And in this situation, there is typically an immediate need to actually prove value fast, also often with quite constrained resources. And this is typically where a use case led approach makes sense. You start with 1 or a few well-chosen use cases that can be executed quickly to prove value. So this is essentially a more bottom-up approach where use cases are either identified through operational insights or through running a quick use case discovery exercise. If done properly, I think this is an approach that is typically a very good starting point. And I think we have also, this is a very common approach, of course, and we have seen this approach work well in many different industries and companies. So just to provide an example, we had a tech client that was struggling to execute a growth strategy because they lacked predictive insights. And we then helped them prove the value of building a predictive customer lifetime value model to forecast unit economics and to guide their marketing investments. And once the results then were clear, they could then sort of scale up the funding into this approach and sort of ensure that all the leaders bought into changing the way of working. And this ultimately changed how they were doing marketing investments, where essentially AI and data got embedded into the most critical decision processes that regarded growth investments, like deciding on how to distribute the marketing budget across markets and channel, as an example. So I think this is a quite sort of good story on how this has been a successful approach leading to transformation in the end. But I think it's when you think of your approach, it's always important to also think of the trade-offs for each approach. And in this case, I think it's important to emphasize that if you, for example, approach the wrong use case, or especially you don't really manage to get the commitment from the business, there's a high risk that you end up doing isolated proof of concepts that in the end doesn't turn into transformation or value. And I think this is also a quite typical scenario as well, which is often referred to as falling into the proof of concept trap. So definitely something to be aware of when choosing this approach. Now, in the second scenario, we meet clients where business capacity exists, but authority and funding are fragmented across functions. And in this situation, this is where a function-led approach makes sense. You essentially work with the business function or the functional leaders within the functional processes to help identify and prioritize the most promising AI use cases and start to push those towards value. And I think it's important to emphasize here that this is a very effective way to ensure a business-driven transformation from the start and start to build maturity into the different functions in the company while driving value and impact. But it of course also runs into limitations if the value that you're after depends on cross-functional coordination and collaboration. So going a bit deeper into this, when you choose this approach, as I said, your goal should be to work with the functional leaders within the processes to identify the most pressing bottlenecks and pain points. So as an example, if you're focusing on sales, you might go deeper into the lead generation processes. And if you're focusing on finance, you might go into quote to cash. And I think now the main difference is that you're moving from being use case first to workflow first. And I think it is then important to emphasize that, of course, all problems that you will identify will not only depend or include AI as being the best sort of solution. So really understanding what's really the problem and find ways to improve those processes, and then of course have other solution hypotheses as well, I think is very important when sort of taking this approach. You should always aim to solve things as simply as possible. So let's consider a case example at a large industrial organization that structured its AI transformation around the function-led model. And in this case, the value of AI was already proven because they had already executed a few use cases and sort of demonstrated value. And we had also helped them build an AI strategy, which also included defining the value potential on the functional level. So the challenge here was not really or that's a bit of a simplification, but the biggest challenge in the end was not to get the mandate, but more the siloed organizational structure, and that AI maturity varied a lot between the different functional units. But with secured top management support, the organization then used a functional-led approach to build AI maturity within the functional units and to start to sort of push initiatives into value. And this approach essentially involved helping each function work from their strategic priorities into value hypotheses, defining the use cases that were then validated and pushed to become embedded into their core workflows. So I think this is a quite solid approach to take, and especially to ensure a more business-driven transformation. And I think it's also important to emphasize here that one of the results here is, of course, that you then get these initiatives, they become function-owned, and the business is then committed to progress this forward and to also fund these initiatives. But there's always also limitations to this approach. I think in this case, we already started to see some redundancy in the type of use cases that were identified and executed upon on the different functional units, and also that some of the improvements were more sort of sub-optimizing, doing improvements in a larger process as a whole. And I think that leads us to the next scenario. And in this scenario, we find clients where the fragmented cross-functional processes are more the main constraints. And of course, AI alone, being just a tool, will in the end not really fix that. But this is where a value flow-led approach makes sense. This typically involves at least a broader operating model shift, and then AI would then, of course, be only one of several themes for driving improvements in these value flows. And of course, in simple organizations, this can be a relatively lightweight shift, but as we are now focusing on more complex, larger organization, this of course become a big transformation in itself. And you wouldn't typically brand this as an AI program, but rather an operating model shift to now start to ensure the benefits of AI. So the trade-off here is that in this approach, we focus on end-to-end outcomes and customer value, but at then the cost of speed and simplicity. This is, of course, a bit more complicated change to drive in the end. So I think while this, of course, can have a lot of impact, this can be a riskier starting point if you need to be able to report back value quickly to secure funding for your program. So if you are on that level, you probably want to go for the functional approach first. So then, again, let's take a practical example here where we're working for a large global industrial organization. who are now completely redesigning their operating model around value flows, where then AI is one of many themes for driving these their improvements. So in this approach, they are essentially working from what drives customer value into understanding the value streams. They do process and systems mapping, look into how they can standardize these processes, and then look into AI enablement and sort of get started with execution. And this is, of course, a massive program. But I think the result from an AI perspective here is, of course, that you get your AI opportunities well aligned to these end-to-end value flows, with also clear accountability for adoption and value realization. Okay, so that's the three approaches. And I think the key point here is to remember is that you should choose the right approach based on your existing maturity level and the current constraints that you have in your organization. So if you need to prove value fast, you typically go for the use case-led approach. And if you need to build maturity in the business functions and ensure a business-driven transformation, you typically go for the function-led. And if value depends on your ability to drive end-to-end outcomes, then you typically go for the value flow-led approach. And I think the most important part here is also to focus on that you should always aim to ensure a business-driven and owned transformation, because that's really a key success factor here.